Morning.
You know, we get a little rain, makes everybody feel just a little better. And we got a nice rain, yes sir. We did, out at McNaught. We got a nice rain out at McNaught this Friday night. And it was nice, good to have. You know, Kay, as I look, well, I don't look. I used to look at our Jimmy's footstool here.
Yeah, I took it off. I'll put it on after it's over with.
Makes me think of Willis Cheatham. And he was our preacher in Oskaloosa, Kansas. And he was a retired preacher, but he was a good preacher and helped us there. They lived in Lawrence, but he would come up. But I think his favorite passage, or one of his favorite, let me rephrase it, one of his favorite passages was 1 Corinthians 12 about the different parts of the body, the different functions. It's good that we have somebody that has the skill to do that. Because if they were relying on me to do that, we would be in trouble.
You put an eyeball down there.
That 180-pound eyeball, Mr. Cheatham's 180-pound eyeball. But it's good that we have people with diverse talents. Because again, if we were relying upon me to make that, we would be in trouble. And it's good. I know that Jimmy has many talents, but that's one of them. You know, we've been looking at Hebrews. And we've been looking at the superiority of Christ. That is not a new idea in the New Testament, or even in the Old Testament, as that we have the superiority of Christ. The example I was thinking of was the Mount of Transfiguration. And I find it interesting that in the book of Luke, we have the account in Luke. It tells us that when they go up on the mountain, that Jesus goes up on the mountain with Peter and James and John, that Peter falls asleep, which, you know, it makes you think of the Garden of Gethsemane, that they have a hard time staying awake when they're tired. But the other two accounts do not tell us that. But it does in the book of Luke, that they fell heavily asleep, and that when Peter wakes up, he sees the three figures, Jesus and Elijah and Moses. And he's excited. And if you are a good Jewish boy and you see three prophets like Jesus and Elijah and Moses, you know, that's like the Hall of Fame. Whether you're talking about the Football Hall of Fame in Canton, or basketball in Springfield, Massachusetts, or wherever. You got Jesus and Moses and Elijah, you've got the Hall of Fame. And so what do you want to do? Well, let's build one. Let's build a building. Let's build 3 tabernacles. And Peter says that. It would be good that we are here. Let us build 3 tabernacles, one for each of you. And then we hear the voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And then the next moment, you know, there's only Jesus remaining. And so we've studied in Hebrews how that Jesus is superior to the prophets and superior to Moses. And that he's superior to the high priest. And we've looked at why. That he's out of the order of Melchizedek. That he is the high priest of a better covenant. And in chapter 9, we discuss how Christ's sacrifice as high priest is superior to the sacrifice the priest of the Old Testament, the Mosaic, Levitical priest. And one of the things as we look at, and we're not going to go through the entire chapter. I'm not, again, there's a lot in Hebrews. There's a lot in chapter 9 that I'm not going to cover. I urge you to look at it, to examine it, and if you want to talk about it, I would love to talk about it. But I'm going to kind of concentrate on one particular area. I'm going to rely upon you to look at more of that. And then if you want to call me, email me, talk afterwards, I would love to do that. But we're not going to try to cover it all. But the chapter starts out as he's talking about, the writer of Hebrews is talking about the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement under the Old Testament was one day a year. And that was when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. He would only go in there one time a year. And he would go and there would be a sacrifice. They would have 2 goats. And one would be sacrificed. And the other goat, the priest would place the sins of the people, including his own, because he had to offer sacrifice for his own sins, onto the head of this other goat. And they would send it to the wasteland. And it says they send it to Azazel. And I don't know exactly what Azazel is. It would be one of the things that we might want to discuss when we have more time. But it says that, you know, this is the way they would do it in the Old Testament. And yet with Christ, we have a different sacrifice. We don't have a goat that we are sacrificing. We don't have the blood of a goat that Jesus is using. Jesus is not sacrificing for his own sins because he had none. Jesus had no sin, so he has no need to sacrifice for his own. He doesn't do it every year. That Christ's sacrifice was once, and that was enough, because it was his blood, that he sacrifices his own life for us. And that is one of the examples of why Christ's sacrifice as high priest under the new covenant is superior to the Old Testament. And we're going to read today, we're going to start in verse 11, and we're going to read down through 15. You know, one of the things is Don, is that, under the translation version that I'm reading from, I'm going across a couple of paragraphs. And normally you don't want to do that. You know, you want to stick with a passage that's all connected. But I thought this is what I want to concentrate, the verses I want to talk about. And I was reading different translations, and I got to Eugene Peterson's The Message, and that's his paragraph break. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but at least he agreed with me on this is where it should be. So we're going to look at verse 11. But when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. As here he's telling us, it's not the blood of bulls and goats. You know what? In the Old Testament, we think of that you sacrificed for sin, and you did. But there were many sacrifices. Many of them were not for sin. There would be a thank offering. There would just be a normal, for your firstborn son, you would offer a sacrifice. It doesn't have to be always for sin. Sometimes it's to make you ritually clean. Under the Old Testament, there was rules that if you touched a dead body, you became unclean and you had to be purified. If you were in the tent where someone died, you became unclean. And you hadn't done anything wrong, obviously. If your loved one died, you had to bury them. You had to take care of that. And it made you unclean. And so there was purification rituals to purify you when you had become unclean, not necessarily because of sin. Now we look in Luke, we're going to look in Luke 5, is that Jesus cleanses a leper in 5, starting in verse 12. And leprosy was one of those things that made you unclean. And I got to tell you, I suffer from psoriasis. And I think that it's very possible when you read about leprosy in the Old Testament, you might have a problem with that. Because leprosy covered a whole bunch of skin diseases. Not just the leprosy we think of now, although it would cover leprosy that we think of today. But it covered a whole bunch of skin diseases. And if you had leprosy, what you would have to do is you had to go out of the camp. You were unclean. You couldn't associate with other people. And you had to shout, unclean, unclean, if somebody was coming toward you. Because you didn't want to make them unclean. And if they touched you, they would become unclean until they could be purified. And we're going to read about Jesus here in Luke 12 with the leper. While he was in one of the cities, there came a man full of leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. And he charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest, and make an offering for your cleansing, as Moses commanded for a proof to them. But now even more the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him, and to be healed of their infirmities. But he will withdraw to a desolate places to pray. One of the things that we see here is the man, instead of yelling, unclean, unclean, he begs Jesus to heal him. And what does Jesus do? Does he have to touch him? We know that there's many examples of Jesus healing without ever touching anybody, without even seeing them. When the centurion comes and says, my servant is sick, and Jesus starts to go to his house, says, no, don't come to my house. I know what it means to be an authority. All you have to do is make the order, and that will be enough. And Jesus doesn't even see the person and heals them. We have the man who comes with his daughter who's sick, and Jesus doesn't even make it all the way back to the house, and the child is healed. There are other times when they let the four guys let the crippled man down through the house. Jesus speaks to him, and he arises and walks. But Jesus, in this instance, touches the man. Why do y'all think he touched him? I think there's a couple. This is what I think, and then maybe this is not necessarily what the Bible says, but I think it's consistent. It's just not doesn't tell us. It's consistent with Jesus. Is one, a leper as unclean, nobody would touch. He's someone that's in the lowest position that you could be. He's dependent upon other people to bring him food. He doesn't work. He can't do anything. He can't associate with people. And Jesus touches him. And I think that's an example that we can learn from. Because even though leprosy is not a huge problem in our part of the world, there are people who are untouchable. There are people who are the very marginalized, that no one wants to have anything to do with. And Jesus took the time to touch this person. And I think that's something that we can learn from. The human touch, to be willing to touch someone, is very important to people. And also, I think one of the things goes right back to what we've been talking about, is this clean and unclean situation. By touching this person, Jesus, under the law, became unclean. And he would be subject to going to the priest to be cleansed. But the thing about it, Jesus, is the unclean does not make Jesus unclean. Jesus' holiness, Jesus' cleanliness cleanses the leper. And he turns everything upside down. Again, that what Jesus does is not what they're expecting. He doesn't have to follow the rituals because of who he is. And by touching this person, he heals them, he makes them clean, and it does not make Jesus unclean. When we're looking here in Hebrews 9, one of the things it talks about in 13, for the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled person with the ashes of heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God? This heifer, the writer of Hebrews, he's the only one that talks about the priest of Melchizedek. He's also the only writer in the New Testament that speaks of the Melchizedek, the king of Salem. He's also the only one that talks about this heifer. And in Numbers 19, this is one of those strange parts of the Bible that I don't fully understand. But God gives them the command that once a year you take a red heifer, has to be a red heifer, that has no blemish, has never been yoked, has never been tied to a plow or yoked with another animal. You take it outside the camp and you sacrifice it outside the camp. The priest that actually did the sacrifice then has to go get himself clean. And the next priest, they burn this red heifer up completely. They don't slaughter it, they burn it up down to the ash. And while the heifer is burning down to ash, this priest adds into it cedar wood to the fire, and hyssop, which is a plant that we see several times in the Old Testament, and scarlet thread. And I don't know what all the significance are of those. But once you had burned the heifer and the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet thread down to ash, the priest would collect the ash and he would save it all year. And when someone who had touched a dead body or had become unclean for whatever reason, and he would go to the priest to be made clean, the priest would sprinkle this ash into water and then sprinkle it on the people. And that would make them clean, ritually clean. That's one of the things that would allow them to be part of the community. Not so much to take part in the religious acts. It didn't clean their bodies so much as it would clean ritually. The Jews, as we've seen in the New Testament, were very concerned with cleanliness. Not just spiritual cleanliness or ritual cleanliness, but more to the point, they were very much involved with bodily cleanliness. So we talked about on the Day of Atonement, before that high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, he had to take a bath. And he had to change clothes. And once he went in and came out, he would change clothes again and take another bath. They took lots of baths to be sure that they were clean. You know, when you go to, and I haven't been to Qumran, but Kay has. If you'd like to talk to her about Qumran, she'll talk to you about Qumran. It's a desert community in Israel. Or is it in Jordan?
It's in Israel.
And it was a time, around the time of Christ, a little before and a little past, as this group of Jews decided they wanted to withdraw from the world. They wanted to be as pure as we can. We want to follow the law as closely as we can. In order to do that, we've got to get rid of all the impurities. So they go off by themselves to have this community. And they bathed all the time. And they have lots of baths. Is that you go down a set of steps into a bathtub. And you go down one way because you're dirty. And then you go up another set of steps because on that side you're clean. And they would do this all the time. It was very much a ritualized system. But one of the things we have here in Hebrews 9, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. You know, Paul uses the word heart a lot, that we translate heart. You know, to have it on your heart. When we were looking at the quotation out of Jeremiah 31, it talked about that God will write his law on our hearts. The writer of Hebrews uses the term conscience pretty much interchangeably with heart. That we want to have our inner being to have it right with God. Not just ritually, but have it right with God from our inner being. You know, the idea of purifying us from dead works. When you look at a typical congregation in the first century, you would have Jews, you would probably have some pagans, and you might have some other Christians that are in there. It's a mix of people in there that have come to the Lord. And when you look at the pagan worship, if he's talking to pagans, he's talking about, under the pagan religion, for dead works, if you did the right ritual, if you called on the right name of the right God, and you offered the right sacrifice, you said the right incantation, that God had to do what you wanted to do. That was the belief. It was magical. It was based upon you doing the right thing and saying the right words. It had to be done. And I think that's one of the things that the writer of Hebrews is condemning here. This would be the dead works. The Jews had a long history of being concerned with ritual and doing the right sacrifice and having the right festivals and not doing God's will. This is not a new idea. It is here, but it is throughout the Old Testament. When you look at the prophets, you look at Amos and Micah, Hosea and Isaiah, all of them talk about, I don't like your sacrifices if you are not living the right life. And we're going to look at one. We're going to look at Isaiah chapter 1. And I think this will be an example of how God did not like it. This is Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 12. When you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feast, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves and make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless. Plead the cause of the widow. So even at the time of Isaiah and other times, God is saying it's not about your dead works. It's not about sacrificing the right red heifer. It's not about having the right ashes. It's about having the right heart. And that's what he's telling us today too. The dead works are certainly applied to us. If we are thinking that we're going to earn our way to heaven by doing the exact right combination of things, what God is saying is, I want your heart. And if he has our heart, if we love God, then the rest of it's going to come into place. That we will follow his word. If we love God, we will follow his word. But he wants that justice. He wants us to work for plead the widow's cause, to seek justice, to help the oppressed. That if we don't do that, all of our church attendance and those kind of things will not satisfy God. He wants our entire lives. And when we look at this, it tells us, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. To serve the living God. And it tells us in verse 15 there that Christ is our mediator. We've seen that before. You know, one of the things about touch, that we saw him touch the leper, is that the tradition tells us that in ancient Israel, that if two people got into a problem, they disagree over the price of a cow, they get in a disagreement over a piece of property, a boundary, and that, you know, now you go to court, you file a lawsuit, and you have years of discovery and waiting to go to court. Then you may have a 2-week jury trial, and then you make your decision. Now, you couldn't do that in those days. There just wasn't time for that. If you had that long a dispute, and you were spent that much time arguing over this, you weren't out working, and the piece of property that you were arguing over isn't being used, and that could have disastrous consequences to your family. So what you would do, the two of you would go down to the gates of the city, and that's where the elders would meet, and you would pick one, and you would present your problem to him. And the few pictures that are, not pictures, but the carvings that we have, it shows a man in the gate with his arm on both of them. And he would stand there with his arm on both of them to work it out between them and reach a decision by the end of the day. Because by the end of the day, you need to be at work. It was a very fast system of justice. And when you think of Jesus as our mediator, that's a vision that I like. Him standing there with his hand on us and his hand on God and standing between us and to keep us reconciled with God. And that's one of the things that Christ's blood does, is it reconciles us to God. And that's one of the things that we have as a blessing, that Christ's sacrifice on the cross is a way of being reconciled to God. It tells us in 1 John 1:7, but if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. As we talk about the sacrifice of Jesus, let's not forget that. The cross is there. Let's never forget the cross. Let's never forget the sacrifice that Christ made. Because he sacrificed himself for each of us. And that he is there as our mediator. And he is there as the sacrifice. But as we look at the last part of verse 14, it says to serve the living God. And I think that comes down to us is what is our responsibility in this? We've talked about what Jesus has done and how that's superior to what went on in the Old Testament. But where are we in this? We have one hand, we have Christ with his arm mediating between us and God. But when we look at Romans 12, and I know that Kay thinks that I can't go more than about 2 weeks without getting to Romans 12, but we're there. 12:1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And we see there in Hebrews, and we see throughout the New Testament, and even places in the Old Testament, that Christ made that sacrifice. He went to the cross, and he went to the cross out of love for us. But it also says that we make a sacrifice, that we are a living sacrifice. And when we think of being a living sacrifice, I think of our day-to-day lives. Most of us are not going to have the opportunity to sacrifice our lives in death. I mean, give our lives as we think of as you rescue someone and you die. But we all have that time to live our lives for Christ. And I think the way we look at that is each day we make small decisions. And each day when we make those small decisions, do we include Christ in our decision making? Are we making a decision, even on the small things, that submit to Christ? Are we giving our lives for Christ? And I think we make that, we do that in making small decisions every day. Consider Christ. What is His in this? What does Christ want us to do in this? And I think that we also should think is that when it may be that we need to touch someone that is an untouchable, as we saw Jesus do. And we have those in our lives. That when we talk about sacrificing on a daily basis, that living our lives as a living sacrifice, that may be part of it. I want to tell you a story that I wasn't there, but when Kay and Peter went to Africa with her brother, they were in villages, they were ministering in villages in the deep jungle. And it was not a building, not clean, and a lot of times they would have a meal. And the meal was what those people could provide, which might not be very much. And it's in a pot, a common pot. And it may not look very appetizing. You don't have plates, you don't have utensils. You go by, you scoop up a handful of whatever's in that pot, and you eat it. And sometimes the guy in front of you has leprosy. And so you're sitting there as, how do I honor this person? How do I show dignity? How do I give them the honor that they deserve? And you put your hand in there and you grab a handful of food to eat. And I've never done that, but Peter and Kay got to do that. And I think that is an example of one way that sometimes you make yourself a living sacrifice. Is you may eat something that you don't want to eat. That you may show love to somebody that's not very lovable. I know I've also told the story, but I'm going to tell it again because I like it. And we were in Honduras, and they said, y'all come down and help us feed this homeless shelter. And we did. We show up with 20, 25 people. And there's jobs to, dip out the beans into the cup, hand it to them, rice, and a drink. It just doesn't take 25 people to do that. You have a little line, you get it done. And so we said, well, what do you want the rest of us to do? We're here to help. And they said, what you need to do is hug these people. Because nobody touches them. These are the dirtiest. When you are the poorest of the poor in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, it's pretty poor. It says nobody touches them. Nobody pays attention to them. And so if you will just give them that human contact, that will be a blessing to them. And I shook a lot of hands. I might not have hugged a lot of people, but I shook a lot of hands. But I'll tell you, Kim hugged everybody. The most people that I didn't really want her hugging, but she did. And so she was willing to touch the untouchable. And as we think of this, as we think of what we do as a living sacrifice, let's remember Christ's sacrifice. Let's remember that He is our mediator, that He is inviting us to be part of His kingdom, to be part of making this world a better place. And it may be very small. It may just be by touching someone that's untouchable. But that is His invitation to us, as He is here to make this world a better place. As it says in the model prayer, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And our role in that may be very, very small. But I think if we take it seriously, if we take the idea of being a living sacrifice, just as Christ sacrificed Himself on the cross, if we take up our cross daily, that we can make a difference in our world. And that is the offer that Jesus is making to us, is to make that difference with Him. If anyone has a need, if anyone needs prayers or needs a concern or any need, if you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.